The Ghost Recon franchise has taken a bit of a misstep with Ghost Recon Breakpoint, a game that tries to do too many things at the same time but doesn't do any of them particularly well. Reception for the open world title has been lukewarm at best and abysmal at worst, and a critical look at the game and its failings make it easy to see why. In this feature, we'll be covering 13 things about Ghost Recon Breakpoint that haven't sat very well with the player base, and we'll be starting with something that's becoming more and more of an issue in Ubisoft games of late. Bloat. More is better is a mantra that Ubisoft games have been following for the past few years, and this has resulted in their titles feeling a bit too bloated at times. We saw this criticism with last year's Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but with Breakpoint, the bloat feels more egregious than ever. Open-world games often get criticized for having needlessly large maps that are filled with repetitive and uninteresting activities, and Breakpoint checks all of those boxes. Sure, we're always looking for value for money in our purchases, but with Breakpoint, it feels like the game favors quantity over quality. Quests. Speaking of uninteresting activities, Ghost Recon Breakpoint falls into the trap that we're all so skeptical of in open-world games. Repetitive side quests and activities that don't really give you much incentive to engage with them. But it's not just the side activities that suffer from this. Main missions in Breakpoint often end up being dull and tedious. Credit where credit is due. The game does try to mix things up every now and then, at least as far as the main missions are concerned, but other issues, which we'll also be talking about in this feature, drag down those main missions as well. Identity crisis. This is one of the biggest issues with Breakpoint. It feels like it doesn't know what sort of game it wants to be. It presents itself as a story of lone soldiers fighting against insurmountable odds, but half-baked mechanics clash with that. It's supposed to be a tactical shooter in the vein of its predecessors, but then it throws in decidedly not very tactical gameplay mechanics into the mix, which we'll get into in a bit. We mentioned earlier that it tries to do too many things at the same time, and not only is that something that contributes to the game's aforementioned bloat, it also makes it so that Breakpoint feels like elements from various Ubisoft games have haphazardly been thrown in together, even if they don't mix. Loot. Does every game need to have a loot system crammed into it? Well, Ubisoft certainly seems to think so. Not satisfied with introducing loot mechanics in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where they actually worked, and Far Cry New Dawn, Ubisoft decided to shoehorn them into Ghost Recon Breakpoint as well. The only problem is the entire loot system is woefully half-baked and ends up making very little impact on the game. What we're left with is a pale imitation of Ubisoft's own far superior The Division 2. Survival mechanics. The loot mechanics aren't the only new element in Breakpoint that's half-baked. The new survival elements suffer from the same issue. Unlike the loot game, the survival mechanics are at least conceptually interesting, and if they'd been implemented properly, they could have made a meaningful impact. As they exist in the game right now, though, it feels like they're here just for the heck of it. Your actual engagement with the survival elements is cursory at best, and what could have been an excellent marriage between gameplay and narrative ends up feeling like a needless afterthought. AI. This right here is probably Ghost Recon Breakpoint's biggest problem. This is supposed to be an authentic tactical military shooter, so you'd expect some level of a challenge to be found, which sadly is not the case. During stealth, enemies can be unbelievably stupid, making them easy to pick off from a safe distance, while during combat, they seem to think it's a good idea to keep running directly into gunfire. Find a corridor or any sort of a choke point and you can essentially just sit back, camp, and headshot them one after the other as they keep running into your sights. Putting the game on higher difficulties makes it somewhat better, but still not enough to fix the core combat. UI. We don't want to overstate things by saying that Breakpoint's UI actively gets in the way of moment-to-moment gameplay, but it still bears mentioning just how cluttered and messy the user interface is. Going into and scrolling through the menus seems like a chore in and of itself. Scrolling through its map is an absolute pain. The screen where all the quests are compiled is just one giant mess, and the fact that you're constantly navigating all of it with a slow-moving cursor just makes it that much worse. Bland visuals. Ghost Recon Wildlands was no visual beast, but for those who had been hoping that Breakpoint would kick things up a notch in the graphics department, well, there's nothing but disappointment here. Does the game look absolutely horrible? Well, no, it doesn't look bad, but things look bland. The environments are lacking in detail, the art design is drab, the characters look like they've been made out of plastic, and essentially there's very few improvements here over Wildlands. Technical issues. The bland visuals would have been easy to forgive if Breakpoint was at least a technically solid game, but other than a stable frame rate, for the most part, everything else in the technical department is a mess. There's tons of bugs and glitches. Assets and terrain meshes can often take plenty of seconds to load in, while character animations and facial movements can look choppy and out of sync. Open world games deserve a little bit of a leeway in this area, but Breakpoint just feels like a game that needed much more time in the oven. Driving. Ghost Recon Wildlands' driving mechanics were among the issues that people brought up most often when the game first came out in 2017, and they're still very much an issue in Breakpoint. Vehicles not only handle terribly and seem to have weird physics, they also feel floaty and unresponsive, while driving sections also feel extra prone to glitches. Given how big the world in Breakpoint is, it goes without saying that you'll be doing a lot of driving, so the fact that driving isn't very good in this game is not exactly good news. Story. The story is another area where Breakpoint definitely had a lot of potential. The premise of being stuck outnumbered and heavily outgunned in hostile territory is an inherently interesting one, while Cole D. Walker could have been an excellent villain. The problem is, Breakpoint doesn't really do much with its setup. The story is largely uninteresting and predictable, and is made even worse by some of the worst writing we've seen in a major AAA game in a while. John Bernthal deserves credit for doing the best that he could with what he had to work with, but it's far from enough to salvage the story. No AI squadmates. One of the biggest draws of Ghost Recon Wildlands was being able to roam its open world with 3 other players, but if you didn't want to do that, you still had AI companions by your side. Tackling missions with these companions, feeling like an elite military unit, executing multiple targets in coordination was just as fun as it sounds. Breakpoint, for some reason, decided that if you're playing solo, you're going to be absolutely alone, no AI squadmates whatsoever. As you can imagine, that's quite disappointing and a big missed opportunity. Ubisoft did say that they'd be adding AI teammates post-launch, and frankly, that update cannot come soon enough. Microtransactions. Monetization is something that we worry about in pretty much every AAA release these days, and it's an area that Ubisoft has come under increasing criticism for the last couple of years. Breakpoint, however, is probably the worst microtransaction model in years. You can purchase virtually everything in the game, from guns to weapon blueprints to attachments. Ubisoft will, of course, try to justify this with the good old, it's all optional, and they're just time savers arguments. But let's not be fooled here. What the game is pushing you to do is pay for progress. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.